Hello everyone, welcome to the Narcissism Decoder, a YouTube channel that's designed to take a comprehensive look at the various facets of narcissism from different psychoanalytic perspectives. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. In today's video, we will focus on what is commonly known as the covert narcissist. In psychoanalytic terms, this is what we refer to as the craving narcissist. The goal is to respond to several questions that I received about the covert narcissist, and the main bulk or the main gist of the questions was, how do I relate to somebody like this in my life? In other words, if I'm not in a position to leave this individual, how can I relate to them in a more empathic way, in a way that I can understand them? And what sort of tools or strategies can you give me to relate to them? So this is part one of a two-part series because this is a really complicated topic, and I don't think we'll be able to get it all in just this video. So stay tuned for part two. At that point, we'll go a little bit more in detail about specific techniques that we could use when trying to engage with somebody like this. So one thing that I feel is always helpful is we need to think about what are the descriptive factors. In other words, how do these people present? What is the cause? In other words, what are the origins? See, if we want to understand and relate to these people in our lives, I think we need to have some sort of theory, some sort of understanding of how they've come to be who they are today. And then finally, that will allow us, once we have that foundation set, to think about, okay, so how do we relate to somebody like this? Now, there is so much content out there in terms of what I would call the descriptive factors. That means that they describe the covert narcissist very well. So I'm not going to take our time to go into that too much today, but just a really quick review, just to sort of lay some sort of foundation that we could build upon, is these are the individuals who present as complaining, pouting, whining. They never really seem to be satisfied in life. You know, they're also very clingy and demanding. So they have a sort of passive way about them, but there's also a certain level of aggressivity. Now, they're not as aggressive as the other types of narcissism, which we'll discuss too at some point. But you may find that you're irritated when you're with them. And this is what we call passive aggressive, right? That somehow you feel angry, but they're not overtly doing anything. But oftentimes, that's an indication that they're maybe putting too much pressure on you to meet their demands. So when these individuals are not given to, they tend to either collapse as if they can't function, or they tend to pout or whine or complain even more. They become more demanding. Sometimes, when not given to, they can present as quite upset and you don't know what's going on, because suddenly they get very upset because they're quite sensitive as well. And you don't know what's happening, but they're upset with something that you said, and they shut down. And they may even leave. And they may not even talk to you for days or weeks. These are also the type of individuals that I find who may present for treatment, and initially they seem depressed. But in my experience, what I've discovered is when they are treated with an antidepressant medication, sometimes a course or two, because different people respond to different types of medication, their symptoms of depression don't usually remit. And when that happens and someone doesn't respond to a particular medication, that may be an indication that depression is not the correct diagnosis. These are the individuals who make, in my field, what we call a narcissistic object choice. And I'm going to describe this in far more detail in later videos. But in short, what that means is these are the type of people. Here's a few examples. Someone may have an automobile mechanic in the family, and their car needs work. So they ask their family member on the weekend to work on their car and do these repairs. And they don't have any understanding of the cost, what this would cost the family member. But they just have this feeling like family helps family. shouldn't this person work on my car through the weekend? Or alternatively, a young fellow once said to me that his girlfriend could come and pick him up and drop him off at work. And why shouldn't she pick him up and drop him off at work? She's my girlfriend. In other words, this is something that we call, again, in my field, ego-syntonic. It's completely just understandable to them that their girlfriend would just pick them up and drop them off at work, or alternatively, that their relative would just work on their car through the weekend. It's not something they question. Now, in terms of technique, or in terms of how we relate to people like this in our life, the first order of business is we need to make something that's ego-syntonic, ego-dystonic. And all those fancy words mean, it's as simple as we want to help them, we want to put them in a position where they can begin to question their beliefs, okay? In other words, we're not telling them, and we're not directly questioning their beliefs. This is critical when thinking about how to relate to these people. We're not telling them what to think, and we're not questioning what they think, but we're trying to help them begin to question their own thoughts and behaviors. I encourage you to explore these descriptive factors. They're really helpful in terms of identifying the person that you're with, but as I mentioned earlier, there's so much material out there. Just Google covert, not craving, because that's more of a psychoanalytic term, but covert narcissism, and you'll be flooded with information. Let's spend our time looking at the cause, the origins, why somebody becomes this way. And in order to do this, we need, in my opinion at least, we need a theory. Because theory guides technique. And when I say technique, what I mean are the strategies in terms of relating to these people in your life. So for today, we'll just look at one theory, okay? We'll look at a psychoanalytic theory because I'm a psychoanalyst and I'm biased. Yes, that's true. But these are the theories that have worked for me in terms of helping these individuals. So there's a theory by Margaret Mahler. She's a renowned psychoanalyst. She did a ton of research on early interactions between mothers and children, like infants developing children. And one thing that she came to discover, remember, this is just a little piece of the theory. If you want more information on this, you could go check out my podcast, episode 4. I go into far more detail about the theory. But basically what she discovered is that if development goes accordingly, there's this early stage of development that all infants go through called the symbiotic stage. And according to other psychoanalytic theories, this is also called the narcissistic phase of development. And that's why I'm choosing this one particular theory, because we are talking about narcissism. If things go accordingly during this stage of development, the infant developing child is left with an experience of attunement, of responsiveness, of a sense of developing trust that the caregiver will be there to meet their basic needs, because they can't meet their needs, so they need to trust that a caregiver will be there, right? And if things go accordingly, as they begin to gradually separate from the caregiver, they begin to understand and own a sense of self alone, a sense of self with others, right? And this becomes really important in terms of developing a sense of identity and a sense of autonomy. And yes, this actually means, when I say being alone, Winnicott used this phrase, another renowned psychoanalyst, the capacity to be alone. But I'm not referring to just being alone, because sometimes I hear this when I discuss it with individuals. They say, oh, I could be alone. But in particular, what I'm talking about is the capacity to be alone when with others. See, that's very different, because that means you have to be that when you are with somebody else and they're not there for you. In other words, they're not giving you something. They're not attentive to your needs. You are now alone. And how do you cope with something like that? So if things go accordingly, this developing sense of self with other, right? Sense of identity, all of this begins to develop, but things do not always go accordingly. Sometimes this symbiotic stage, this early narcissistic stage, where there's supposed to be this sort of really nice, blissful feeling of union with another, is ruptured too early and too abruptly. How does this happen? This happens when there is consistent, now I don't mean just every now and then, a caregiver is not attentive or available to the developing child's needs, but this has to be pretty consistent, where the caregiver is preoccupied, the caregiver is perhaps selfish or narcissistically sort of involved, the caregiver could be depressed, the caregiver could have their own conflicts about nurturing the child, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a moment. So when this happens, there's this rupture in this blissful state of development. And then later in life, with the covert narcissists, they're always trying to recapture this blissful state, this early narcissistic state of development. Because it was almost like they were robbed of that opportunity. They were robbed of that experience. The goal of the craving narcissist then is to achieve this sort of blissful contentment, which is characteristic of this early stage of development. And here's an example. The baby cries and the breast appears. And I'm using the word breast symbolically, but I think you know what I mean. There's a cry, there's a need, and magically the comforting, support, love, nurturance, it appears. So this is what we call the mode of repair. The craving narcissist mode of repair. Remember, what is it that they're repairing? That this early blissful symbiotic stage, narcissistic stage of development was ruptured too abruptly and too quickly. And this went on throughout their childhood development because they didn't have a caregiver who was attuned to their needs, right? So what's the mode of repair? The mode of repair is that demanding, crying, whining, complaining, right? This is actually the mode of repair. In other words, I must be fed. If I'm not fed, I feel devastated and my self-esteem is suffering, right? So the craving narcissist uses these techniques, right, to elicit a response from what hopefully in their mind is an attentive caregiver. In some cases, you must have noticed this, no work can be done. And I say you must have noticed this if you have somebody like this in your life, this sort of craving, needy type of person. No work can be done to repair that rupture. So here's a very simple example. It's a woman's birthday and she wants a particular cake to celebrate her birthday. So she makes this request and her husband buys her the cake. She comes back and she reports to me that he did buy her this special cake that she wanted, but the cake was spoiled. In other words, she didn't enjoy the cake. Why was the cake spoiled? So this is something that we do. When we hear this kind of stuff, we always want to remain curious. Remember, this is part of turning something that's egosyntonic into something to turn it into something ego dystonic. And we do this by way of expressing curiosity. Tell me a little bit more. What happened that the cake was spoiled? And when I say spoiled, again, I mean that she didn't enjoy it. She didn't enjoy the feed, right? So what we eventually come to see is that she needed to ask her husband for the cake, that he didn't automatically know. In other words, he didn't have clairvoyance, right? He didn't have what we call omniscience to know what was in her mind, because he should know and she shouldn't have to express this need. And by the way, this is very common sort of across all the different types and clusters of narcissism, right? So in this case, there's ambivalence about accepting the feed, and she can't do it. Now, there are many reasons that people can't accept the gift. They can't accept something of value. But one explanation, if you think about this, if we go way back again in development, this is one possible psychoanalytic explanation, that when the mother was giving her, or the caregiver, let's say, I said mother because those were those early studies that Mazzella conducted that I mentioned earlier. If the caregiver is giving something, but they're giving it to them out of their own fears, So in other words, if you think about the helicopter parent, which is a term I'm sure you're all familiar with, and which is not uncommon, again, with all the different clusters of narcissism, is that they have a parent who's overly intrusive, too giving, right? But you may be saying, wait a minute, how could you have a parent who's too giving, but they're not giving out of their out of a need? It's not what the developing child needs. It's out of a fear of the caregiver's own concerns and conflicts about separation, right? In other words, they need to overly compensate. They need to always be there for the developing child. And this induces a level of conflict into the child, sort of through osmosis, right? Because the child doesn't know this, but in a way they do know this, right? They know that they're not trusted, in other words. In other words, an implicit message is given to them. When you have a smothering helicopter, or what's called, in this day and age, it's called the bulldozer parent, who actually comes in and takes over assignments or functions for the child, it sends an implicit message that you can't handle this on your own, that you need this support. And that's fostered in this kind of early family, right, environment. In other words, the family fosters a level of dependence and neediness because of the caregiver's own conflict around issues of separation and individuation. I'm going back to Mazzella theory. All right, listen, that's enough said for today. There's still so much more on this topic that we need to cover. If this raised any questions for you, or there's in any way that I confused you, please feel free to reach out, shoot me an email, let me know. But otherwise, if you want to hear more about specific ways to turn something ego-syntonic into something ego-dystonic, stay tuned for part 2 of this series on the covert narcissist. Until next time.